Alright, so today's video is on the judicial branch checks and balances. We're going to look at what the Constitution has to say and the implications. So we're going to start with the Constitution. The principles of checks and balances is the idea that we have three separate powers that each are able to influence the other branches in order to make sure that not one branch gets too much power. We're going to start with the power of the judicial branch over the other two. The court really only has one major power, and that's the power of judicial review. The court can declare laws, presidential actions, and anything the bureaucracy does unconstitutional. This means that they have to stop and do whatever the court tells them to do. But as we remember, Federal 78 says the judicial branch is the weakest branch because they have no power of the purse or the sword to actually enforce their ruling. So if they tell the president to stop doing something, potentially the president could ignore them, and there really wouldn't be much they could do about it except get upset. They couldn't actually stop him. So then the question becomes, how do they even have any power at all? Now, when we're looking at the power of the executive branch over the judicial branch, one of the big ones is that the president nominates all the judges, although they get to serve for life. So President Obama has gotten to nominate 2 members to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the other 7 all got their jobs before Obama came into office. Several of them were appointed by George Bush, and several of them by Bill Clinton. The president also has the power of the sword through the bureaucracy and can enforce all the laws and all the rulings. So, of course, the president is supposed to enforce anything the judicial branch says. And lastly, the president can sign laws that limit the courts. For example, sign a law from the legislative branch adding justices and things like that. The president also has the Solicitor General, who is the top chief lawyer for the executive branch. One of the big questions that any court has to answer is who gets certiorari, who gets to be heard in front of the Supreme Court. Remember, they only hear about 70 to 80 cases a year, and so it's a big deal if you get to be in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. So they're denying 99% of all the cases that show up at their door. So who actually gets to be heard? The answer? Whoever the president wants to get heard. So Solicitor General, who works for the president, can submit a brief or written statement to the Supreme Court saying which cases the president is interested in having decided that year. And statistics have shown that about half of the cases heard will involve the Solicitor General. What we're seeing then is that the result is that the Supreme Court pays attention to what the president wants. They don't have to, but because the president enforces their decisions, they try to listen so they can keep the president happy. If they do what the president wants, then when they need to tell the president to stop doing something, he'll probably listen because he's also getting his way sometimes. But if they always just piss off the president may eventually push back. Another thing the Solicitor General can do is submit an amicus curiae brief. Remember, that is a friend of the court. And so that is a brief with someone who's not involved with the case. And what we see is that when the Solicitor General submits an amicus curiae brief, the court usually decides the way the president wants. Not always, but usually. Which again shows how much power the president has over the court and even their decisions. Next, we have the power of the legislative branch over the judicial branch. Now, while the president nominates judges to serve on the Supreme Court and the other federal courts, the Senate has to confirm them. Now, for the lower courts, we have something called senatorial courtesy. What this means is if there's a court in your state, like if there's a court in Kentucky that needs a district judge to be nominated, the president will go to the senior senator from Kentucky and ask for a list of names. And that senator will give the president a list of names of potential judges that he wants to have serve as judges, and the president will almost always pick from that list to nominate. This usually means that the judges getting nominated get through this confirmation process very easily. The Supreme Court is a different story. There, the president nominates. There will be no list for the Supreme Court. It's the president's list. It's then sent to the Senate Judiciary Committee. And remember, this is Senate only. They'll hold a hearing where they interview the nominee. The Judiciary Committee will then have an up or down vote to send the nominee to the full Senate. And during that time, we have what's known as the litmus test. The litmus test is where the Senate asks them questions about their positions or their beliefs on certain key topics. The two big ones are abortion and gun control. If you want to become a Supreme Court justice, you never answer this question. You never give an opinion on abortion, you never give your opinion on gun control, and you try to avoid any case that has to do with these topics. Because basically what happens is all the Democrats will vote for you, all the Republicans will vote against you, and you get screwed. So you have to just make sure to avoid these key topics. You tell them it doesn't matter what my opinion is because I'll decide the case based on the case, not based on my opinions, like any good judge. But this is known as the litmus test. They'll always ask, they'll try to find out, and if you wrote an essay about abortion in college, well then you're never becoming a Supreme Court judge. That's it. Now the next part then is the Senate debates and votes on whether or not to confirm the nominee. Now, just like any law, the Senate can filibuster. So if someone really doesn't like you, you might need 60 votes to end the filibuster, but then you only need a simple majority, or 51 votes, to actually get the job. But it's very difficult, and you have to be very good at making senators happy. Next, Congress can write laws. For example, they can set the number of courts and judges. Currently, there's about 13 appellate courts, but there could just as easily be 1,000. If Congress wants there to be 1,000, then they'll write a law making 1,000. One thing that happened with the Congress and President Franklin Roosevelt is that the Supreme Court kept overturning all their laws. Every time they passed a law, the Supreme Court would declare it constitutional. And so the President with Congress said, look, we're going to add 7 more justices to the Supreme Court. We're going to move it from 9 to 15. And those 7 are going to be picked by President Franklin Roosevelt and confirmed by this current Senate. So if you don't start changing your decisions, then that's what we're going to do. And the next law they passed, the Supreme Court did not declare it unconstitutional. They let it go. So there are ways for Congress and the President to work together to threaten the courts if they don't like what they're doing. Which of course then calls into question whether the courts are making fair decisions or if they're making political decisions. Congress has the power to amend the Constitution. If they can get 2/3 of the House and the Senate to change the Constitution and then get it ratified by 3/4 of the states, well, that's the very tool that the judicial branch has to use. So if you want to make abortion illegal in the Constitution, then it wouldn't matter what the court says. They'd have to make it illegal because they can only interpret the Constitution. But currently, abortion is not mentioned in the Constitution. Therefore, the Supreme Court can decide whether or not it's allowed. Congress also has the power to impeach. If there's a judge or a justice who is doing something wrong, then the House can vote to impeach and the Senate can have a trial to remove them from office. If both majorities agree, then that person could get removed. So you do have to be careful if you're in the Supreme Court what you're doing there. And then there's the power of the purse. Congress can decide how much money a justice gets paid, but once they set an amount, you cannot lower that amount for the duration of how long the judge is in the seat. So you cannot threaten them with their paycheck. But you could just say in the future, you're not going to fill that court and you're going to close that court because you hate it so much. The effects of all of this, the implications. Justices have to think about what their goals are, about what strategy to use, and the context that they're in. So the goals of the justice are probably going to be their policy positions. Do they want there to be gay marriage? Do they want you to have more freedom of speech or less freedom of speech? Do they believe that What do they believe in terms of warrants and search and seizure? All of that stuff is really kind of based on their beliefs. And what we find is that if you look at the political party of the judges, you can guess 9 times out of 10 what they're going to say about any case. Which of course leads to the question, is it predetermined? Do we just already know in advance how a judge will rule? The answer is oftentimes yes. The context is that Supreme Court has to rely on the other branches to enforce their rulings. So they can't piss them off too much or too often. If they do, they'll start to get ignored and they'll lose their power. So they often have to willingly give up power in order to keep power when it counts, which of course is like playing a big game of chess. And they have to be very careful because they're the weakest on the board. Then there's strategy. They have to look at public opinion, they have to look at history, they have to look at the other branches and the other justices to take a case and make a decision. They're not just basing these decisions on the facts of the case. If the court has decided as a group that they want to make gay marriage legal in the United States of America, then they're going to do it, but they're going to play a very long and careful game to make sure that it gets done right so that it actually works. Usually, the court is pretty timid, and they don't really try to make huge decisions because they know that there could be problems if they get too influential, and that history has a lot to say about courts like that. Brown v. Board is an example of a positive time where a court went out on a limb, changed a whole bunch of things, and then made a really big impact for the good. We have just as many examples of the bad, and we'll be looking at that when we look at all these cases. So a closing question is, do you think the system of checks and balances should influence the opinion of a judge when hearing a case? Why or why not?